The Byzantine Empire ran for over 1,000 years. And in that time, it produced emperors who bit people's heads, monks who formed armed street gangs, and a fork that got declared a tool of Satan. These are 33 facts about Byzantium so absurd, so dumb, and so genuinely unhinged, you will spend the rest of the day telling someone about at least one of them. 1. Emperor Justin the Second started out as a fairly competent ruler. Managed affairs of state, made decisions, did emperor stuff. And then his mind just completely fell apart. By the end of his reign, palace servants had to push him around in a small wheeled cart, like a toddler being rolled through a supermarket, except this toddler was the supreme leader of the Eastern Roman Empire. And he bit people, on the head, full-on chomped down on his servants' skulls like he was taste testing them. The only thing that kept him calm was organ music. So just picture this scene for a moment. A deranged emperor rolling through the marble halls of the great palace in a little wagon, gnawing on the heads of terrified servants, while a panicked organist plays non-stop to prevent him from screaming the walls down. That, ladies and gentlemen, was the leadership of one of the most advanced civilizations on the planet. 2. In the 11th century, a Byzantine princess named Theodora Dukaina married into Venetian nobility and brought a small golden fork with her. Seems harmless, right? She used it at a banquet to eat her food, and the local clergy absolutely lost their minds. A fork, a tiny utensil with 2 prongs. The priests declared it an instrument of Satan himself because, and this is their actual logic, God gave humans perfectly good fingers to eat with, so using a fork was basically an insult to the creator. When the princess later died of a plague, the church pointed at her corpse and said, "See, that is what happens when you eat with the devil's pitchfork." It took Europe several more centuries to accept the fork. Centuries. Because of 2 little prongs and a whole lot of religious panic. 3. Emperor Basil the First was a tough guy. He literally wrestled his way into power, founded the Macedonian dynasty, and ruled the Byzantine Empire with an iron fist. So naturally, he died in the dumbest way imaginable. On a hunting trip, a deer somehow got its antlers tangled in the emperor's belt. And then it ran. It dragged the most powerful man in the Eastern Mediterranean through the forest for roughly 16 miles. Finally, one of his guards caught up and cut the belt with a sword to free him. Did Basil thank this man? No. Basil, barely conscious and probably concussed beyond reason, decided the guard had actually tried to assassinate him by pulling a blade near the imperial body. He ordered the guard executed, and then Basil died from his injuries a few days later. He killed his own rescuer and then died anyway. 4. The Hagia Sophia in Istanbul is one of the most sacred and magnificent buildings ever constructed. A masterpiece of architecture, a jewel of human civilization. And if you look closely at one of the marble balustrades on the upper gallery, you will find something carved into the stone in Norse runes. It reads, roughly translated, "Halfdan was here." That is it. A bored Viking guard, probably stationed in Constantinople as part of the imperial bodyguard, stood in one of the holiest buildings in all of Christendom and scratched his name into it like a teenager vandalizing a bathroom stall. The carving is still there today, over 1,000 years later. Halfdan, whoever you were, congratulations. Your graffiti has outlasted entire empires. You left a more permanent mark on history than most kings ever did. 5. In the year 532, Constantinople had 2 major chariot racing factions, the Blues and the Greens, and these were not just sports fans. They were more like political gangs with season tickets. They had street armies, political connections, and an intense hatred of each other. But during the Nika riots, they did something unprecedented. They united against the emperor. The trigger was a mix of tax grievances, political corruption, and 2 faction members who had escaped execution. The combined mob set fire to half the city, burned churches, government buildings, and nearly toppled Emperor Justinian himself. He was literally about to flee the capital when Empress Theodora told him she would rather die in purple than run. Justinian stayed, sent in his generals, and the result was a massacre of roughly 30,000 rioters in the Hippodrome. all because of chariot racing and taxes. 6. When foreign ambassadors arrived at the Byzantine court, the emperor wanted them absolutely terrified before negotiations even started. So they built the Throne of Solomon. This thing was a mechanical marvel. When an ambassador would kneel and then look up, the throne would physically rise toward the ceiling, carrying the emperor up with it. So when the ambassador lifted his head, the ruler was suddenly towering above him at an impossible height. And flanking the throne were giant mechanical lions made of gold that would roar and slap their tails against the floor. There were also golden birds on a golden tree that actually sang. All of this was powered by hydraulic mechanisms. The entire performance was designed to make foreign diplomats think they were in the presence of something more than a man. And honestly, if I walked into a room and the chair started levitating while robot lions roared at me, I would agree to whatever treaty was on the table. 7. If you lived in the Byzantine Empire and thought you could avoid taxes by just being poor and minding your own business, think again. The empire had a tax called the kapnikon, which literally translates to smoke tax. The way it worked was beautifully simple and infuriating. If smoke was coming out of your chimney, you owed money. That is it. Cooking dinner? That is taxable smoke. Trying not to freeze to death in winter? Taxable smoke. Essentially, the government figured out that if your hearth was burning, you were alive and functional enough to be squeezed for revenue. It was a tax on the basic act of existing in a building with a fire. You could argue it was actually a primitive form of household tax, but the fact that they measured it by looking at your chimney is just peak Byzantine bureaucracy. Even breathing warmly came with a bill. 8. Mount Athos is a peninsula in Greece that has been an autonomous monastic community for over 1,000 years. And it has one very strict rule: no females allowed. And they mean no females of any kind. Not women, not girls, not female animals. The monks cannot keep hens. Think about that. Roosters are perfectly fine, but a chicken that lays eggs is considered a violation of the sacred rule. So for centuries, the monks have had to import their eggs from the mainland, because the idea of a hen walking around the holy mountain was apparently too much of a spiritual risk. The ban is still in force today. Even female cats and dogs are not allowed. There are approximately 2,000 monks living there, and they have maintained this rule since roughly the year 1046. Almost 1,000 years of no hens, no exceptions. 9. Emperor Justinian the Second was overthrown, and his enemies wanted to make sure he could never rule again. Their method was elegant and brutal. They sliced off his nose. In Byzantine culture, a mutilated face meant you were unfit to be emperor. So they cut it off and shipped him into exile, assuming that was the end of him. They were spectacularly wrong. Justinian spent years in exile, burning with revenge, and eventually came back with a solid gold prosthetic nose strapped to his face. He looked like a villain from a fever dream, and he acted like one too. He retook the throne with the help of a Bulgar army, and then proceeded to hunt down every single person who had wronged him with extreme prejudice. The man literally lost his face, replaced it with gold, and came back angrier than ever. That is the most metal comeback in political history. 10. The Byzantines had a weapon so terrifying that its very name became legendary: Greek fire. This was a liquid substance that could be sprayed at enemy ships from bronze tubes mounted on the prows of Byzantine warships, and when it hit water, it did not go out. It burned on the surface of the sea. Imagine being on a wooden ship and watching the ocean itself catch fire around you. There was no way to extinguish it. Water made it worse. It clung to surfaces, it burned through wood and flesh, and it turned naval battles into absolute nightmares for anyone fighting against Constantinople. And here is the wildest part. Nobody today knows what it was made of. The recipe was such a closely guarded state secret that when the empire eventually fell, the formula went with it. Historians and chemists have been trying to reverse engineer it for centuries, and we still do not have a definitive answer. 11. In the Byzantine Empire, fashion was not just about looking good. It was a full-on political statement about how little physical labor you had to do. and nowhere was this more obvious than with sleeves. Among the wealthy elite, sleeves were deliberately designed to be absurdly long, sometimes dragging along the ground as the wearer walked. The message was crystal clear: my hands do not need to be free because I do not work. The longer your sleeves, the richer and more important you were. Imagine trying to function in daily life with fabric pooling at your feet every time you moved your arms. You could not pick up a cup without a 5-second sleeve management operation. But that was entirely the point. Practicality was for peasants. If your outfit actively prevented you from doing anything useful, you had made it in Byzantine high society. Total dysfunction as a status symbol. 12. Emperor Zeno may have experienced one of the most horrifying deaths in all of recorded history, if the ancient sources are to be believed. According to the accounts, Zeno fell into either a deep drunken stupor or a coma-like illness, and his court, perhaps a little too eagerly, declared him dead and sealed him in the imperial sarcophagus. The problem was that Zeno was not actually dead. He woke up inside his tomb and started screaming and pounding on the walls. The palace guards reportedly heard him crying out for 3 days. 3 days of an emperor begging to be let out of his own coffin. And nobody opened it. Some accounts suggest Empress Ariadne herself gave the order to leave the sarcophagus sealed. Whether this was negligence, fear, or cold-blooded murder dressed up as a funeral, the result was the same. Zeno died in the dark, screaming. 13. Emperor Michael III earned the nickname Michael the Drunkard, and honestly, he worked hard for that title. This was a man who turned the imperial court into his personal frat house. His most legendary move was appointing his favorite drinking companion, a man named Grillos, as the Patriarch of Constantinople, which is basically the Pope of the Eastern Church. That is like handing your bar buddy the keys to the Vatican. But Michael did not stop there. He organized elaborate parodies of sacred church rituals, dressing up his drinking friends in priestly robes and staging mock religious processions through the streets of the capital. And the crowning moment? He reportedly rode through the city on the back of a pig, mocking religious ceremonies while the actual clergy watched in horror. The head of the Roman Empire riding a pig, parodying the church he was supposed to protect. 14. The Byzantines were not just good at defending their empire, they were terrifyingly creative about it. Among their many military innovations, they developed what were essentially medieval fragmentation grenades. These were ceramic pots filled with a volatile mixture, likely involving Greek fire or similar incendiary compounds, and packed with shards of broken glass and metal caltrops. Soldiers would hurl these pots at enemy formations, and upon impact, the ceramic shattered, the mixture ignited, and jagged shrapnel flew in every direction. These were not crude improvised weapons. They were specifically designed for maximum damage, burning and shredding at the same time. The concept of a handheld explosive device packed with shrapnel is something we associate with modern warfare, but the Byzantines were doing it in the medieval period with clay jars and ingenuity. They essentially invented the hand grenade 1,000 years before anyone gave it that name. 15. Emperor Constantine V had a complicated relationship with the church, and by complicated, I mean he absolutely humiliated its leadership in public for entertainment. When he decided to punish Patriarch Anastasios, he did not execute him, exile him, or throw him in a dungeon. No. He sat the Patriarch backwards on a donkey, facing the tail, and paraded him around the hippodrome in front of thousands of screaming spectators while the crowd pelted him with animal dung. The spiritual leader of millions of Orthodox Christians, sitting backwards on a donkey, covered in filth, being laughed at by his own flock. And then, after this world-class humiliation, Constantine just reinstated him, put him right back in the job as if nothing happened. The whole thing was purely about sending a message. I can destroy your dignity whenever I feel like it, and there is nothing you or your God can do about it. 16. For centuries, China had an absolute monopoly on silk production, and the secret of how silk was actually made was guarded ferociously. Exporting silkworm eggs or cocoons was punishable by death. The Byzantine Empire was spending staggering amounts of gold importing silk through middlemen, and Emperor Justinian I wanted that to stop. So, around the year 552, two monks, who had been living in China, allegedly smuggled silkworm eggs out of the country by hiding them inside their hollow bamboo walking staffs. They literally walked out of China with one of its most valuable trade secrets stuffed inside their canes, right under the noses of the authorities. These monks delivered the eggs to Constantinople, and within a generation, the Byzantine Empire had its own thriving silk industry. Two guys with walking sticks ended a Chinese monopoly that had lasted thousands of years. That might be the greatest heist in economic history. 17. Emperor Heraclius was one of the most accomplished military leaders the Byzantine Empire ever produced. He fought the Persians, recovered the True Cross, and reshaped the empire's administration. And then, toward the end of his life, he developed an absolutely crippling fear of water. Not just mild discomfort. Full-blown, paralyzing hydrophobia. The problem was that his capital, Constantinople, was surrounded by water. The man could not even cross the Bosphorus Strait without having a complete breakdown. So his engineers came up with a solution that is almost too absurd to believe. They built a floating bridge of boats across the strait, covered it entirely in dirt and sand, and then planted trees and bushes along the edges. Also, the emperor could ride across the water on horseback without ever seeing or knowing he was above the sea. A military genius riding over the ocean, fully convinced he was on dry land. 18. When most people think of monks, they picture quiet men in robes praying in peaceful monasteries. Byzantine monks were a completely different breed. Throughout the empire's history, monks regularly organized themselves into what can only be described as armed street gangs. During major theological disputes, which in Byzantium happened constantly, rival groups of monks would pour out of their monasteries carrying clubs, staffs, and sometimes actual weapons, and go beat the opposition bloody in the streets. These were not isolated incidents. Monastic violence was a recurring feature of Byzantine religious life. Monks attacked government officials, stormed council meetings, intimidated bishops, and sometimes killed people, all in the name of doctrinal purity. So the next time someone tells you that theological debates are boring, just remember that in Constantinople, disagreeing about the nature of Christ could get you clubbed in an alley by a mob of furious monks. 19. Empress Zoe. Porphyrogenita was born in the Purple Chamber, which made her one of the most legitimate claimants to the throne by blood. She also refused to let age slow her down in any department. By the time she was in her 60s and 70s, Zoe had been married 3 times, and each marriage was a political earthquake that shook the empire. But the real legend is her vanity. Zoe maintained a personal cosmetics laboratory right inside the imperial palace, where she and her servants developed creams, lotions, and potions designed to keep her looking decades younger than she actually was. Contemporary historians who saw her noted that even at 70, her face appeared smooth and remarkably youthful. Whether the creams actually worked, or whether the historians were just being polite to a woman who could have them executed, is a question we will never answer. Either way, a 70-year-old empress running her own skincare lab inside a palace is iconic. 20. For a long time, the Byzantine Empire operated under a legal principle that sounds like it was written by pirates. If a ship wrecked on your coastline, everything on board, the cargo, the wood, and yes, even the surviving passengers became your property. This was not some obscure loophole, it was established maritime law. And as you might expect, it created an absolutely horrible incentive. Coastal communities realized they could get rich by causing shipwrecks instead of waiting for them. People began extinguishing legitimate lighthouses and then setting up false signal fires on dangerous rocky stretches of coast, deliberately luring ships to their destruction. Sailors would follow what they thought was a safe harbor light, only to smash into rocks while locals waited on shore to collect the wreckage and enslave the survivors. It took centuries for Byzantine lawmakers to realize that maybe, just maybe, rewarding people for shipwrecks was producing more shipwrecks. 21. The Varangian Guard was the most elite military unit in the Byzantine Empire, a personal bodyguard force for the emperor, made up almost entirely of Vikings and later Anglo-Saxons from Scandinavia and England. These were enormous, axe-wielding warriors with a reputation for absolute loyalty, ferocious combat ability, and one very consistent problem: they drank like it was an Olympic sport. The pay was extraordinary. Varangian Guards earned more than almost anyone else in the imperial military, and they supplemented their income with a unique tradition. When an emperor died, the guards were allowed to rush into the palace treasury and take as much gold as they could physically carry. It was called palace pillaging, and it was essentially legal looting. So the result was a group of fabulously wealthy, heavily armed, perpetually drunk Norsemen guarding the most important person in the Eastern Mediterranean. Effective, but chaotic. 22. Emperor Nikephoros Phocas was a legendary military commander, a man who had retaken Crete and parts of Syria from the Arabs. Hard as nails on the battlefield. But his death came not from an enemy army. It came from inside his own bedroom. His wife, Empress Theophano, had been having an affair with a general named John Tzimiskes, and together they hatched a plan. On a freezing December night in the year 969, Theophano left a window open and lowered a basket down the palace wall. Tzimiskes and his co-conspirators climbed up in the basket, snuck into the imperial bedroom, and found Nikephoros asleep on the floor because the man was so ascetic he refused to sleep in a bed. They woke him up and then butchered him. His own wife turned the bedroom into a crime scene by pulling assassins up the wall in a literal basket. Shakespeare could not have written a better betrayal. 23. The Byzantines inherited thousands of ancient Greek and Roman statues, and they had absolutely no idea what to do with them. Christianity had replaced the old pagan religions, and these beautiful marble figures now represented something deeply unsettling to the medieval mind. Many Byzantines genuinely believed that ancient statues were either petrified humans, cursed by sorcery, or vessels inhabited by demons, and they treated them accordingly. Citizens would knock the noses off statues to blind them and prevent them from seeing. Others wrapped statues in chains to physically restrain them because there was a widespread belief that statues could come alive at night and wander the streets causing harm. Imagine walking through Constantinople at night and genuinely worrying that a marble figure of Aphrodite might step off her pedestal and come after you. That was a real fear for real people. 24. In most Christian art, saints and holy figures are depicted with round golden halos above their heads. But the Byzantines had a special category, the square halo. If you were a living person, still alive and breathing, but important enough to appear in a religious fresco or mosaic, usually because you donated a mountain of gold to build the church, you got a square nimbus instead of a round one. The round halo was reserved for the dead and the officially holy. The square one basically said, this person paid for this building and is still alive to appreciate being on the wall. It was the medieval equivalent of getting your name on a building at a university, except instead of a plaque, they put you in a sacred mosaic standing next to Jesus, just with a slightly less prestigious halo shape. A subtle, centuries-old flex that most people today walk right past without ever noticing. 25. The Prince's Islands sit just off the coast of Istanbul, and for centuries they served as the Byzantine Empire's favorite dumping ground for political inconveniences. When an emperor wanted to get rid of a rival prince, a brother, a son, or anyone with a claim to the throne, he would ship them off to a monastery on these islands. But this was not some comfortable retirement. The unlucky exiles were forcibly tonsured, which meant having their heads shaved as a sign of monastic life, effectively disqualifying them from ever ruling again. And in the worst cases, prisoners were confined in underground cisterns, standing in cold water up to their waists for weeks at a time. The idea was to cool their ambitions, literally. You were stuck in a dark, flooded stone chamber until your desire for the throne was replaced by a desire to not die of hypothermia. Byzantine politics at its most creative and cruel. 26. In the 9th century, a mathematician and scholar named Leo the Mathematician designed a communication system so advanced that it would not be truly rivaled until the invention of the optical telegraph in the late 18th century. He set up a chain of fire signal towers stretching from the eastern frontier of the empire all the way back to the imperial palace in Constantinople, a distance of hundreds of miles. Each tower was within visual range of the next, and each one had a synchronized clock. When an Arab raid hit the border, the frontier tower would light a fire at a specific, pre-arranged time. The next tower would see the signal and light its own fire, and so on down the chain. Within a single hour, the emperor and his palace knew that the border was under attack. That is real-time communication across an empire, 1,000 years before the electric telegraph existed. 27. In the Byzantine Empire, the color purple was not just a fashion preference, it was a legally protected imperial monopoly. Only the emperor was allowed to wear purple boots, and this was enforced with deadly seriousness. If you were caught wearing footwear dyed in imperial purple, it was not a fashion crime. It was literal treason, punishable by mutilation, imprisonment, or death. The dye itself, made from a specific species of sea snail, was astronomically expensive to produce, which is partly why it became associated with supreme power in the first place. But the Byzantines took it further than anyone else. They turned a color into a criminal offense. You could plot against the emperor in secret, bribe officials, build private armies, and possibly get away with it. But if someone spotted purple on your shoes, your life was effectively over. The most dangerous fashion statement in history. 28. In the Byzantine Empire, there was an officially recognized category of holiness that might be the strangest spiritual tradition in Christian history: the Holy Fool, or Eurodivi. These were individuals who deliberately acted insane in public as a form of religious devotion. They walked naked through the streets, threw stones at church walls, ate garbage, screamed at strangers, and generally behaved in ways that would get anyone else locked up or exiled. But the Byzantines believed these people were divinely inspired. Their madness was considered a mask, hiding deep spiritual wisdom beneath outrageous behavior. Holy fools could insult emperors, mock bishops, and break every social rule without consequence, because punishing them was considered punishing God's messenger. Some of them became wildly famous and were venerated as prophets. It was the one job in the empire where acting completely unhinged was not just tolerated, but actively rewarded with sainthood. 29. The Romans were famous for their concrete. They built structures with it that have survived 2,000 years, including the Pantheon's dome, which is still the largest unreinforced concrete dome on the planet. And then somehow, the recipe was lost. The Byzantines, direct heirs of Rome, could not figure out how to make it. The exact formula for Roman concrete, which involved a specific mixture of volcanic ash, lime, and seawater, simply vanished from practical knowledge during the transition into the medieval period. So Byzantine builders had to improvise. They developed a technique of alternating layers of brick and stone in their walls, which was partly an aesthetic choice but largely a structural necessity. And here is the twist. This alternating method turned out to be surprisingly effective against earthquakes. The flexible layering absorbed seismic shock better than solid concrete in many cases. They lost an ancient wonder material and accidentally stumbled into earthquake-resistant architecture. 30. In the Byzantine Empire, where you were born mattered almost as much as who your parents were. The Great Palace in Constantinople contained a special birthing chamber called the porphyra, or the purple room, built entirely from a rare purple stone called porphyry. Imperial heirs who were born in this room earned the title porphyrogenitos, meaning born in the purple. This was not just a cute nickname. It was a serious political designation that gave you a stronger claim to the throne than someone born elsewhere, even if that someone was your older sibling. If your mother happened to give birth in a regular room, maybe because labor came early or circumstances were chaotic, your legitimacy was permanently weakened. Your entire political career could be decided by which room your mother was standing in when her contractions started. An entire system of imperial succession shaped by real estate and timing. 31. In the early 15th century, a Hungarian engineer named Orban approached the Byzantine Emperor Constantine the 11th with a proposal. He could build a cannon of unprecedented size and power, a weapon capable of blasting through the thickest fortifications on Earth. Constantinople's legendary walls had held off invaders for 1,000 years, but they had never faced modern gunpowder artillery. All the emperor had to do was fund the project. Constantine, whose treasury was nearly empty after decades of imperial decline, could not afford the price. So Orban walked across the border and offered the same deal to Ottoman Sultan Mehmed II. Mehmed paid immediately. Orban built the cannon, a 27-foot bronze monster that could fire stone balls weighing over half a ton. In 1453, that cannon was aimed at the walls of Constantinople, and it punched right through them. The empire that saved a few coins lost everything. The single worst penny-pinching decision in the history of civilization. 32. Standing in the middle of the ancient hippodrome in Istanbul, now called Sultanahmet Square, is one of the oldest monuments in the city, the Serpent Column. This bronze column was originally created in the 5th century before Christ to celebrate the Greek victory over the Persians at the Battle of Plataea. It stood at the Temple of Apollo in Delphi for nearly 800 years before Emperor Constantine the Great hauled it to his new capital. The column originally featured 3 intertwined serpent heads at the top, and the Byzantines believed these heads had a magical protective power. As long as the serpent heads remained intact, the city would be free of snakes. And the heads did remain intact for centuries. Until one night, according to tradition, a group of drunk soldiers, possibly Ottoman or possibly Crusader depending on the source, knocked them off. The heads are now mostly lost, and Istanbul, for the record, does have snakes. 33. And here is arguably the single most absurd event in Byzantine history, the Fourth Crusade. In the year 1202, a massive Crusader army set out from Europe with the stated goal of recapturing Jerusalem from Muslim control. They never got anywhere close. Through a catastrophic series of debts, political manipulation, and pure greed, the Crusaders were diverted to Constantinople, the largest and wealthiest Christian city on the planet. And in April 1204, they attacked it. Christian soldiers wearing the cross sacked a Christian capital. They looted churches, smashed holy relics, melted down sacred icons for gold, and committed atrocities against the very people they were supposed to be allied with. The damage was so severe that the Byzantine Empire never fully recovered. The city that had stood as the shield of Christendom for nearly 900 years was destroyed not by its Muslim enemies, but by its own Christian allies. 1,000 years of golden noses, donkey parades, and monks beating people with clubs in the name of God. That was Byzantium. Now, real talk. I want you to pick one fact from this video and tell me in the comments why it is the dumbest. The one with the most likes wins absolutely nothing, but the bragging rights are eternal. Hit subscribe, leave a like, and I will keep digging up history this unhinged.